Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome Andy Jung back to the show. Andy is a Young Voices contributor. He wears a few other hats as well. Andy, tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, so my name's Andy. I'm a legal fellow at Tech Freedom. We're a small tech policy think tank located in DC. So I do a lot of work keeping up with what Congress and the agencies are doing in terms of big tech.
And big tech is on a lot of people's minds as far as Congress goes these days, both for good and for bad. I mean, right now, a lot of people are kind of fixated on Elon Musk and Twitter. But I understand that there have been numerous calls and attempts to rein in big tech, to level the playing field, so to speak. Talk to us about some of the dynamics behind that. Who's calling for these kinds of policy changes and what's their reasoning?
Certainly. So I almost should be careful using that term big tech because it includes a different bucket of companies depending on who you ask. But generally, we're talking about large U.S. technology firms like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. And recently, Congress in particular has been focusing on some bills that would be disrupting these big tech companies' business practices, and even some bills that would be as extreme as forcing these companies to break up and divest some of their smaller subsidiaries. So those are the bills that I'm focusing on in my latest piece.
Now, I'm sure if Congress is doing this, the ostensible reason they're going to give us is, hey, we're just looking out for you, the little guy. I'm looking at an article that you've written for techdirt.com, which points out they have other alternatives, which they may not be looking at. Talk to me about some of those other alternatives that Congress might look at that would actually be more helpful to the average person.
So you hear Congress and lawmakers talk about leveling the playing field for small businesses, and that's definitely a good goal to pursue. In my newest piece, I talk about a different route you could take to leveling the playing field for small businesses and giving them an opportunity to compete a little more evenly or give them even a boost in the technology industry. And that the idea is called a regulatory sandbox.
Now, I'm only familiar with that term because I had the privilege of spending about a year working for Connor Boyack at Libertas Institute in Utah. And I know that Utah actually passed a regulatory sandbox law that apparently has sent some ripples out across the nation. Sounds like others are looking to do it. For people who aren't familiar with a regulatory sandbox, unpack that for us. What do we mean when we use that term?
So a regulatory sandbox is a regulatory framework which lets qualifying companies sell products and services without complying with all the red tape and regulations controlling that industry. So in a way, these sandbox companies are exempt from the regulations and rules governing that industry. But in most cases, sandbox companies are actually not fully exempt from regulations. Certain regulations like consumer protections still apply. And sandboxes can last for a limited amount of time. And companies also pass out of the sandbox once they sort of outgrow that criteria.
But essentially, they're not having to ask for permission at every single turn and, complete this environmental impact statement and so forth. In other words, they're being given the opportunity to innovate and maybe not to be quite so heavily regulated. Is that a fair way to describe that?
Definitely. These small companies apply for the regulatory sandbox. Once they're let into the sandbox, then there are far fewer regulatory burdens they have to comply with and costs that they have to pay in terms of hiring lawyers, meeting all these different burdens, reporting costs, like you mentioned. They strip it down to the bare minimum and in terms of regulation pressure on these companies. And because of that, the companies can experiment more and be more innovative, try more risky business models, knowing that there aren't as many costs they have to worry about in the first place so that they can take a few more risks and be a little bit more innovative.
Andy, what are some of the industry areas that we might recognize where this kind of, this regulatory sandbox is being utilized to provide innovation?
Tons of areas, and lots of different states have implemented them as well. You mentioned Utah. They have an all-inclusive regulatory sandbox, so it applies to all different industries. And one of the places where regulatory sandboxes first started in the U.S. is in Arizona. they have a regulatory sandbox focused only on financial technology companies. So companies that offer apps that help people open bank accounts and monitor credit cards, financial technologies or fintech companies. So you can make a sandbox very small and niche like Arizona has done, or you can make a regulatory sandbox broad and all-encompassing like Utah has done. And both states have seen a lot of success and growth in their programs.
Nice. And are there any particularly promising technologies that you see being explored right now in these sandboxes?
I think fintech is a great industry to be experimenting in because the banking industry has tons of requirements they have to comply with from the federal government as well as state governments. At the same time, people are seeking new ways to access money and want to get easy access to cryptocurrencies and NFTs and technologies like that. And so if you can incentivize entrepreneurs to invest in companies that let users access these banking services more easily without having to ask questions like, do we fall under this banking statute for these states? It really encourages a lot of experimentation and takes pressure off these entrepreneurs to do creative things. So I think banking is one industry, but legal services is another one that I'm very excited about. And that's coming from someone who graduated law school. So I think that's a potential to be a huge industry, a lot of growth in the sandbox for legal services as well.
Is there much resistance within the government or within its regulatory arms? It seems like some people might see this as a threat to their job security.
Well, you see some raised eyebrows in terms of people saying, really, we want companies to comply with fewer regulations. But I think those people are reassured when you tell them that actually regulatory sandboxes don't take away all regulations. And it's up to lawmakers actually to say, you don't have to follow X, Y, and Z rules, but you still have to comply with environmental protections and you still have to comply with consumer protections. So in terms of regulatory sandboxes being a full pass to do whatever they want, that's not the case. And companies are still held to certain requirements to make sure that they're encompassing and pursuing the overall good in terms of the industry that they're in.
Andy, with all the interest right now, and I'm kind of hearkening back to Twitter, it's all about the controversy over content moderation. And, there are people saying Congress should be, calling these companies to do even stricter content regulation. Talk to me about maybe some of the innovation that this could open the door to that wouldn't involve Congress getting deeply involved in these big tech industries.
Sure. So a regulatory sandbox for tech could have certain stipulations in terms of how companies moderate content. And if a company wanted to be part of the sandbox and have pressure taken off them in other areas, the government could potentially stipulate, or the states or Congress, that you have to moderate content in these certain ways, so long as it complies with the First Amendment. That's obviously the most important thing that the government has to make sure that they comply with. But regulatory sandboxes could be a way to experiment with different modes and different forms of content moderation, which is an issue that everyone's very worried about. So why not open up the regulatory sandbox in that issue area and experiment a little bit?
Do you find there are parties that are receptive, to that sandbox approach? I'm trying not to cast too broad of a net here, but some people seem very, very concerned that Twitter, for instance, may have more free speech than they think it should have. They're not worried about being canceled so much as they worry that they won't have the ability to cancel people whose voices or messages they don't like.
Well, I'm not sure about the whole area of speech in particular, but I know entrepreneurs are excited about regulatory sandboxes. People that want to start companies and people that want to experiment with new ideas, but don't know if they can do so without having to go under by having to comply with tons of regulatory burdens. So I'm talking about entrepreneurs that want to start tech companies are excited about this idea. And we see in states which have implemented regulatory sandboxes, entrepreneurs have started new companies in those states, and the programs have been a success. So in terms of people who are looking for certain types of speech, I'm not sure how they view regulatory sandboxes, but people who are pro-business and people who are pro-competition in the market are pretty much across the board pro-regulatory sandbox.
Well, the whole idea of the pro-regulatory sandbox to me sounds a lot like, you know what, you get enough people free enough to work on it, the problem solvers are going to rise to the top. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, the whole idea of competition is that the ideas compete in a marketplace and the best ideas rise to the top. Right now, some people are worried that the big tech companies control the tech marketplace so much that small entrepreneurs cannot break into the market and rise to the top, that the marketplace of ideas has been sort of messed up. Regardless how you feel about the idea, about that concept, introducing new competitors, small companies into the marketplace of ideas is always going to be good and is going to allow more competition to allow more good ideas to rise to the top and challenge these established companies, which is an outcome that I think everybody wants across the political spectrum.
Yeah, as you point out in your article, it's way better to encourage these new innovators and companies to come in and be a part of the situation rather than just, well, let's tear down or dismantle, existing successful companies. Tell us, Andy, where can people find your writing?
People can find my writing on Regulatory Sandboxes on TechDirt, and people can also find me on Twitter, speaking of Twitter, at Andy Jung Tech.
All right, again, we're talking with Andy Jung. He is a Young Voices contributor. Andy, great to catch up with you again. Hope we talk again soon.
I hope so, too. It's really great to speak with you.
And we are back. We're joined on Moving Forward with Young Voices by Cooper Conway. Cooper is a Young Voices contributor and also getting ready to graduate from Boise State University. And Cooper, great to catch up with you again. Congratulations, by the way, next week.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Well, I know school choice has been making a lot of headlines over the last couple of years. I actually believe if there was a good thing about the COVID pandemic and some of the fallout that followed, it's that school choice actually became kind of a front and center issue for a lot of people just because they had to explore different alternatives, and it wasn't business as usual. Now, you have an article in Chalkboard Review about why Republicans should support school choice in Iowa. And before we talk about Iowa specifically, talk to me about nationwide. What's the general trend? I mean, it seemed like there was a pretty good head of steam last year. Are we seeing similar momentum keeping up this year as far as school choice measures?
Well, you're exactly right. We had about 19 school choice victories last year in 2021, which is pretty much unheard of. But this year, I thought going into the year we were going to have a similar trend and there was going to be a lot of school choice victories. And I was right in one sense, is that a lot of school choice bills are active and they've been introduced, but we haven't actually seen a lot of victories. And a lot of this isn't because of the Democrats or teachers unions, which usually oppose school choice, and they still are, and they're doing a pretty good job of it this year, but also because they're getting some help from Republicans in different states like Georgia, Utah, and Idaho.
And that surprises me because these are states that I would typically think, well, if they're Republicans that are, dealing with these issues, of course, they're going to be more conservative. But tell me, what was it what was the opposition that these Republicans in Utah, Idaho, and Georgia were invoking as to why they would oppose school choice bills?
Well, it was a different case for each state. In Georgia, there was a pro-school choice group that sent some flyers around to some constituents in the state saying, make sure you hold your representatives accountable, the Republicans, and make sure they pass school choice. Now, the Republicans did not like those flyers, and so in turn, they just dropped school choice, and the real losers were the kids, right? And then in Utah, the governor kind of came out and said, I'm not going to be passing any school choice or voucher bill unless these teachers are paid $60,000 or more. And that's because he received some donations from teachers unions. And then in Idaho, this is more of a similar trend that we see when Republicans kind of hop off the school choice boat, is that a lot of rural representatives believe that school choice is going to negatively impact their local public schools.
Okay. Well, all right. It's not purely, it's not, ideology. They're not frothing at the mouth. I kind of expect that from the teachers unions. They really get upset at competition. But talk to me about Iowa. Why is Iowa a place where school choice is front and center? And what's their situation?
Well, Iowa doesn't have a lot of school choice opportunities. And so this recent bill that was passed in the Senate really would expand school choice for about 10,000 students from lower and middle income families. Middle income families being, for a family of four, the most a family that can make is around $110,000. And so they're trying to create an education savings account that would allow 70% of the state per pupil funding, which is around a little over $5,000, to follow the child to nearly any education expense that they may choose. So whether that be a private school, learning materials, tutoring, or special needs therapies, that would really help a lot of children and just give them some more flexibility.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, this wouldn't just apply, to the private schools that would affect it. They could apply that same money to their children's education in terms of the public institutions that they're accessing?
It would about 70%, and the money would follow from the public institution. So if they decide to leave their public school, they can use this money at any basic private education expense.
Now, would that include homeschool?
Yep, that would include homeschool.
Wow.
So, yeah, it only limits it to education expenses, but it's very, very flexible when it comes to that.
And what kind of support is that receiving? Among the population, is that something that seems to be receiving a groundswell of support?
Well, recent polling according to EdChoice shows that 66% of all adults in the state of Iowa support ESAs like the ones that they're trying to create. And it's about 76% of all school parents. So this bill is extremely popular. It's bipartisan support in terms of the people in Iowa, but not necessarily in terms of the politicians in Iowa.
So what's the politicians' opposition? Are they seeing this as, they're losing some influence because these parents actually have more choice, in their own hands?
Yeah, well, as you were mentioning earlier, Democrats usually oppose school choice. It's in the party platform. Teachers unions have a lot to say about that. A lot of funding goes into that to be able to protect the public schools in terms of the money that's going there. But Republicans, it's very much similar in that they don't want these rural schools to have some negative effects. But the research doesn't really back that up at all in terms of the negative effects that public schools have once school choice programs are implemented. For example, we know that once a school choice program is implemented, public school students' test scores actually increase in 25 of the 27 studies done. So this is really just the rising tide that lifts all boats type of situation going on when school choice is proposed and implemented. Are
other states now taking a little closer look at what Iowa is doing? I mean, this sounds like a better version of previous attempts that I've seen to bring school choice to states. Is Iowa becoming one of the states that's leading out now in this issue?
Yeah, well, this ESA that Iowa is proposing is really the gold standard of school choice. In that it provides the most flexibility, the most empowerment that it gives to these students and these families. And so we're seeing other states like Oklahoma, for example, hopefully will be able to push their school choice bill across the line this year. And then I hope personally, as I'm in Idaho right now, that Idaho comes back next year and passes an ESA. And I think they're ripe to do so.
Well, who are the people doing the heavy lifting on this? I'm curious. Is it nonprofit public policy institutes? Is it grassroots parents organizations? I'm just curious, who's trying to move the needle here?
Well, some nonprofits, some think tanks, they always do a fantastic job. But in this case, with last year with the school closures, and then also some differences amongst opinion in terms of curriculum that's being put into place in these public schools, it's the parents that are really taking charge. And people talk to me all the time. It's like, how much good does, 10 moms who are for school choice do? And I say, you never underestimate a mom that's upset and wants something better for her child, because they will get it done. And that's what we're seeing. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see here in Iowa and hopefully in Oklahoma as well.
Cooper, given some of the really divisive topics that have found their way into some school curriculum, CRT and different gender ideology topics, does this help to ease that contention when parents have choice as to where they send their kids? In other words, not every school is going to be teaching out of those same woke playbooks.
Yeah, it does ease the tension a lot. School choice is often cited as a great tool that is able to lift people's test scores and help them with educational attainment. I know that was certainly the case for me, as my family was able to use school choice for my sister and I'm going to be graduating college in a week and a half, and she's going to be graduating next year. But also for my family, it was a lot about the moral values that were embedded in us. For me, as a Christian, that was going to a private Christian school where I could go to class, and my dad was my teacher all 4 years of high school. But that's for a lot of different families who are trying to make sure that their children have the moral values that they want them to have. And so whether that means more CRT, I guess, or having no CRT at all, school choice definitely is the tension in that vote.
And I have to ask, we got about a minute left here, but I have to ask, I know one of the big objections I often hear when it comes to school choices, but what about the poorest, the most disadvantaged among us? It sounds like Iowa pretty effectively addresses this in their proposed policy.
Yes, this school choice bill is specifically meant for students that come from lower income backgrounds and some middle income families as well. School choice is really empowering for these families, because wealthy families, they're always going to have access to the best schools, whether that means moving into a neighborhood that they're assigned to with a great public school, or taking the money and just paying twice. For me, I don't see why a lower income family, or any family at all for that matter, should have to pay twice for an education. I think that we should just have the money be following the students and not the system.
All right, we're talking with Cooper Conway. He is a contributor for Young Voices and soon to be a graduate of Boise State University. Again, congratulations, Cooper. Where can people find you on social media?
Yep, they can find me at Cooper Conway with the number 1 on Twitter, and then they can find my work at the Young Voices website with my headshot.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Kenneth Schrupp back to the show. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Kenneth, tell everybody a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm a public affairs consultant and writer on the intersection of politics, media, and business at Young Voices. I like to take a wide-ranging interdisciplinary approach to my writing and cross a wide range of fields, because I think that's what we need to understand the greater American picture.
I'm reading an article, actually, I was reading an article earlier that you had written for theamericanconservative.com, Waging War on Obesity. And I have to say that you've got a really good take on this, although we hear talk about, well, it's war on this and war on that. Talk to me about why obesity is front and center in a lot of people's consciousness right now.
Well, I mean, there's a few things to unpack here. First is why obesity and why now? We know COVID is the thing that has overtaken us in our national conversation for the last 2 years. And it's really astonishing to me that there's not more in the national conversation about how we can help people be healthier overall. And that significantly means losing weight. People who are obese are 3 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID. 74% of Americans are overweight or obese. Ergo, you'd think that we'd have some kind of national movement to say, okay, we're not going to shame you for being fat or overweight. We're not going to, but we are going to recognize that this is a shared problem that we have. To put things into context, we spend about 47% or more of all of our dollars on chronic illness to obesity-related factors. And there's a Milken Institute study that estimates this cost us $1.72 trillion in 2016, which was then 9.3% of GDP. And that's sort of why I make this comparison, why really we are going to have to wage war on obesity, because that's 9.3% of GDP was more than peak Cold War U.S. defense spending.
Wow. Now, I don't know. My memory's fuzzy from when I was a kid back in the 70s, but as I look at pictures from back in that time period, like if you were to see a crowd shot, oh, look at everybody, either out shopping or walking down the boardwalk or at the beach or something. It's not that overweight people didn't exist, but the percentage of the population that was carrying a lot of extra weight seemed much, much smaller at that time. And that's just, I think that's my own bias that in looking at that. But I'm curious, do the statistics show out that, since life got easier, the computer age, and we spend so much time looking at screens, have we seen a corresponding jump in terms of real obesity?
I mean, the biggest jump was when in the post World War II era, once we made that switch from home cooked meals to more processed food and instant meals. But that really started to pick up in the 70s and 80s. It was really 1980 that you see these things go off. So there's a strong correlation between us living less active lifestyles and switching to far more processed foods.
And okay, so I have to ask this just because I'm not going to deny that there's an obesity problem. I'm carrying, some extra table muscle that I really wish I wasn't. What do you think is the best way to approach it, though? I'm leery about telling government, hey, here's a problem, solve it, because it seems like coercion is really the only thing that they have at their disposal to try to solve problems.
So, yeah, I also agree that mobilizing government to mandate or require new things is not going to likely get us the results that we want. Right? Most of major American industries all benefit from the status quo of where more and more Americans are becoming, overweight or obese, increasing their consumption, becoming reliant more on drugs and medical interventions, not able to moderate their consumption of goods, so they generate more debt and more interest. A population that doesn't move as much consumes more screen time. If I can imagine a future where the industries we seek to regulate will simply rewrite the regulations to maintain the status quo. In terms of what we can actually do, we can start off by changing some of the subsidy structures that make processed food so cheap, right? The United States, we pay as a result of a Great Depression, Dust Bowl era policies that paid farmers extra to plant corn because it's a grass that keeps the soil down. We now use a third of our corn just to make bioethanol, and then the rest of our corn we use to make tons of high fructose corn syrup. We don't actually eat a lot of our corn. We either feed it to cows, which just gives them tremendous amounts of inflammation and makes their meat very unhealthy, or we use corn syrup because we have such high sugar tariffs. I mean, there's all these cascading effects where if we simply were to end or transfer these subsidies from corn or these grains to even fruits and vegetables, not even eliminate them entirely, we could have a much healthier population.
Okay. I mean, look, I love convenient food as much as the next person, but I have to agree. There's a trade-off. If it's highly processed, it may be filling your tummy, but it's not necessarily doing you any favors. What about for the food producers? Are they the primary recipients of these subsidies? Is there anything in terms of policy that would persuade them to use their resources to promote more healthy eating choices?
In this case, it's the growers who directly receive the subsidies. Farmers don't. Farmers. Farming is a very tough business. It is a really tough business. So you're going to grow whatever is the safest financial option for you to grow. And all the government subsidies currently make growing corn or growing soybeans the best and safest crops for you to grow. It really is a hard business. But that's not what's really best for the health of Americans. And so because farmers make the most reliable income from growing these crops, there's a huge abundance of them, which means that the processors who purchase the crops from these farmers do so at an unbelievably cheap price. And we dump that all across the world market, by the way. We're not just worsening Americans' health. Our mechanized production and highly subsidized corn, grains, you have it, get dumped into foreign markets across the world and wipe out their local farming sectors, which is usually the first industry that needs to be modernized for a country to get out of the poverty gap. So we're not just damning ourselves to unhealthy, unproductive people. We're really impoverishing the rest of the world.
You mentioned in your article, too, that loneliness is something that kind of goes along with, this obesity epidemic, and that, if we have proper support, and I'm going to translate support, accountability. I take better care of myself when I'm being accountable to a workout partner or, a coach or even just, my family. Hey, have we been for a walk today or something like that? Talk to me about why don't we talk more about obesity? Is it because we're worried somebody's going to accuse us of fat shaming people for not being svelte?
I mean, let's be honest. It is something that is talked about as a personal moral failing, but it's something that if it's a problem that 74% of Americans have, then surely it's something that we can't keep taboo any longer, and that the people are going through similar challenges and struggles. I talk about how, we might be able to have some better urban planning and be more have more walkable cities, or might shift subsidies around. Realistically, those are just nibbling away at the edges. It's really a cultural problem that we have, where are such a lonely society, with such little interaction and support with each other, that we do turn to just food as our comfort, even if everything else is going well for us. 3 in 5 Americans are lonely, and we know it's as deadly as obesity in terms of your health. People really should be able to reach out to each other and hold each other accountable, and understand obesity is something that we have to defeat together.
And, as much as I love the ability to do work online, I mean, it's made it wonderful. It's made it possible for me to work from home. There have to be some alternatives to just sitting and looking at screens and living life, via social media. How do we turn the corner from that virtual existence back to a, in the real world existence?
I think it really could start with communities and with eating. One of my friends has a food startup, an event in a supper club, where he brings people from all across the area to these fantastic, marvelous dinners. People who've never met each other get to mingle, talk, learn about food, learn about like the systems of food, and how they can be happier, healthier people. And you meet all kinds of people from across the area, and you build a better, stronger social network. It's fantastic. I think food really is, it's the way that we've gotten into this problem, but it's also the way out of the problem.
We've got about 1 minute left, but I have to throw this out there. Is there any benefit to people producing more of their own food?
You know what? I think there really is. You know exactly what's happened to your own food. You're probably not going to use a ton of pesticides. It's very low cost for you to do so. And having a relationship with food helps you remember your relationship with nature and the environment, that we're not just these people who can live in these concrete blocks and live through our screens, that we're part of nature, we're part of this planet.
All right, we are talking with Kenneth Schrupp. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Kenneth, where can people find you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter at Kenneth Schrupp. That's SCHRUPP. Thank you very much.
And welcome back. This is our final segment today of Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm happy to welcome Roy Mathews, who is a Young Voices contributor, back to the show here. Roy, tell us just a little bit about yourself for those who are meeting you for the first time.
Well, thanks for having me back. Like you said, I'm Roy Mathews. I'm currently a public policy associate at the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure in Washington, D.C., and I'm a graduate of Bates College. When I'm not researching energy, transportation, or climate, I like to keep track of Eastern Europe, Russia, and all things Central Asia, because it's, I think, one of the most fascinating areas of the world to focus on.
Haven't heard anything about it, especially lately. I'm just kidding. It is on a lot of people's minds. And actually, I'm looking at an article you wrote for nationalinterest.org, and I learned a new word here, or at least I learned a phrase that I had never learned before, Finlandization. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about why Finland's future is with NATO. And let's start with that word Finlandization as a starting point.
So Finlandization is a Cold War, a very Cold War era concept. It comes from, obviously, the country of Finland, and Finland's forced neutrality during the Cold War. Finland never joined NATO, but it never fully aligned with the Soviet Union. It was not a Warsaw Pact member. And that was because Finland actually got into 2 different wars with the Soviet Union, the Winter War, which is sort of early 1939 to 1941, and the Continuation War, which was from 1942 to 1945. And essentially, Finland, being a very rural and sparsely populated country, managed to hold back and inflict heavy losses on the Soviet military. However, they eventually lost that war. And the Soviets essentially came to an agreement with Finland that they wouldn't join the Warsaw Pact, but they weren't allowed to join NATO. The Soviet Union was allowed to build military bases in their countries, pack civil society full of their flunkies, so to speak, and force Finland to be a neutral country. And the reason this came up recently is because that French President Emmanuel Macron proposed that Finlandization, quote, might be a scenario that Ukraine might want to consider in order to stop the current Russian invasion.
So essentially, Ukraine would become a buffer state, kind of like Finland was.
Yes. Finlandization Finland was exactly right. A buffer state between sort of the more neutral but pro-Western Sweden and Norway and the Soviet Union. Finns very much do not like the term. Very insulting. The Ukrainians that are currently fighting were also very insulted. I think Volodymyr Zelensky came out and essentially said that that option wasn't on the table, and tried to cover Macron and say that that was never elaborated on by the French president. But it's on the tape, and a lot of Ukrainians are not very they're not really willing to lay down and accept the fact that there'll be a buffer state.
Well, it's pretty clear that Russia has real heartburn about the prospect of Ukraine being a part of NATO. In other words, having NATO right up against their border. Finland is a little more removed, but talk to me about NATO in general. Its mission was to hold back the Soviet Union, which I believe had kind of the stated purpose during the Cold War of we will. I think Khrushchev said we will bury you. They were very much on a crusade of conquest. Is that the case with Russia today? In other words, does NATO still does it justify its existence and its expansion? What the world needs?
I think so. Yes, it's a great question. I know we've talked about this previously, but for the countries that have to deal with Russia as an immediate neighbor or are in Russia's sort of historical sphere of influence, like Finland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, NATO is still pretty relevant. As for NATO expansion, Finland has watched Russia invade Georgia in 2008. They said we're not going to join NATO. We're going to stay the course. Finland has topped the record charts for like the happiest citizenry, the least corrupt country. It's the country that most of the democratic socialists point to in this country when they want an ideal society. They saw Georgia and they said we're not going to join NATO. They saw the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014. They didn't want to join NATO. Now that has started to change since Russia has actually launched a land war. Finland has put out some feelers to try and see if joining NATO would be first off, be possible, which I think it is. The checklist for joining NATO is that you have to have a functioning democratic system based on a market economy, fair treatment of minority populations, and an ability and willingness to contribute to NATO operations, and a commitment to democratic civil military relations and institutions, which Finland all meets. However, there is some hesitancy that if Finland were to join NATO, then that would be almost a middle finger, if you will, to Russia, and that could provoke a similar Russian response like they have done in Ukraine towards Finland.
And I guess that was the next place I really wanted to go. Finland doesn't strike me as being quite the proximity or having the economic might or the contested regions, that Ukraine does, the Donbass and Luhansk and so forth. But if Finland were to join NATO, would Russia see that as a big a provocation as Ukraine joining NATO?
So I believe one of the Russian foreign ministers stated that if Finland were to join NATO, then we would reconsider positioning of nuclear weapons in that area of the country, which, does set off alarm bells and scares people. But you mentioned that, Finland is not a very heavily populated country. There's 5.5 million people in the entire country. So that's less than my home state of South Carolina. It does have the second largest border with Russia in Europe at 1,300 kilometers. However, I learned that Finland is one of the last European countries to mandate conscription in its constitution. So every single Finn, be it male, female, must serve in the armed forces. And there are laws that mandate that pharmaceutical companies and industries have to maintain a critical stockpile of materials in case of Russian aggression. And this comes from their experience during World War II. I do think that it might be a provocation, but from what the research I've done for this article, the Russian military has sort of been, exposed as being pretty incompetent. The supply lines that have been used to resupply invading forces in Ukraine have been horrible. You've seen pictures of the Ukrainian farmer towing tanks back to Russia, and convoys running out of gas. And so there is a camp that says, well, the Russian military hasn't been able to take Ukraine, so the Finns really have nothing to worry about. And that is a good insight. However, long term, I think that Finland should consider joining, just because the threshold for military action in Moscow is now so much lower than it was back in 2014 or even in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia off of a false flag operation. And Finland has a lot of experience dealing with Russian disinformation or trying to commit false flag operations to justify an invasion. Just one last thing. I know I'm kind of going on a bit long. During the Winter War back in the 1939, that was actually triggered by a Russian false flag operation. Russia shelled a border post in the frozen reaches of inside the Arctic Circle in northern Russia, eastern Finland, and then used that as a justification for a military that was under Stalin. It killed maybe 4 Russian border guards. So they've been there. They have that experience, and I think that would be really invaluable for NATO.
And if I recall, Finland, as you mentioned, they did a very good job of holding their own against those Soviet forces back during the 1939-41 campaign. I'm trying to remember. It seems like one of the legendary snipers of all time was Finnish, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, the nickname White Death. I think he has the most confirmed kills of any sniper in any conflict. And the Finnish army was mostly on skis. They really did a great job of breaking up the Russian military and forcing them onto frozen lakes where there was no cover, and pretty ingenious resistance, ultimately unsuccessful. But if any country has experience with Russian aggression, it's them. And I really think they could be an asset to NATO and really protect this happy, prosperous country that they've built.
Okay, again, we are talking with Roy Mathews, who is a Young Voices contributor. Roy, where can people find you on social media?
So you can find me on Twitter at yaboyroy98 with an underscore in between yaboy and Roy. I made it when I was 15, so I apologize.
You are forgiven.
But other than that, I'm on LinkedIn. I post all my articles there. But also, if you're interested in energy and transportation, check out Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure at AII.org. If that is your policy expertise and want to know more.
Okay, thanks, Roy. Great visiting with you.
Thank you.